In this video and the upcoming videos, we are going to go deep into the rabbit hole of Flexbox and encounter three properties that can drive you mad in some examples. Now, remember, I said before that working with Flexbox is kind of more of an art than a very specific science. And we will now start touching those regions where this really gets, where this kind of really applies. Now, with Flexbox, you cannot really have this approach that, I don't know, you might have with I don't know, working with some tools in, let's say, Photoshop or something, where you say, okay, I want to know exactly what that tool is doing, and then please, now I know what to expect, and my stuff will always behave the way I want it to. Now, since Flexbox is, as the name says, designed to have to be flexible on its own, this flexible in that sense kind of is is a kind of warning sign because it says I am going to decide how I am flexible, but kind of on my terms. And the effect that this has is that you will encounter results that you did not expect necessarily, and you will not immediately understand them. Now, when you go deeper into Flexbox and the rules and have some experience, you will probably start to say, okay, I know because the container has that, and here this property is set like that. That means that the child is behaving like that, and you will start to understand those things, but this will not happen immediately. And while for the very simple cases, you will be able to do most of the stuff 9 of 10 times without a problem. This 10th time will drive you mad for a while until you really start getting it. And obviously, I'm also encountering those cases still. And then I have to sometimes look at an example for an hour or so, look at all the containers, and then after an hour, I get this aha moment. Okay, so what am I talking about here? Let's get more specific. What are the properties, the three properties that we are talking about? Now, when we select one of our familiar elements and go into our flex section, we already talked about the direction property. What we are going to talk about now is the basis property, the shrink property, and the grow property. And now, as opposed to many of those other properties that you can kind of say, okay, I have this property in some isolation and I can just see what it does, you should not think about those three properties along those lines. You should think about them kind of as a unity or as a trinity in that, for that matter here. Now, think about them as you are always setting all of them. Now, and you kind of are always setting all of them because they are never unset. Now, they start with some default values, which are 1 for shrink, 0 for grow, and normally auto for the basis. And now, for those of you who come from the web world, you might be familiar with the fact that in CSS, it's actually a recommended way to have a command which is called flex, an instruction where you are actually setting all three of those properties in one line. And that's actually telling because basically CSS is telling you in this moment, don't look at them in isolation, always treat them as being kind of tightly connected and influencing each other, and kind of only making sense when you treat them together as a unity. So let's have a look what that means. We will start with the most confusing one at the beginning, which is the flex basis. Now I'm having my one red element here, and I set the flex basis to auto, and the first thing that happens is you cannot really almost see anything except a small little thing that might come from some tiny margin from the text element inside here. but basically the element shrinks to nothing, although my basis is set to auto. Now, when I set this up, I actually wanted to set this to 200 pixels, and now you can see that our element grows to 200 pixels. Now, there are two kind of good ways to describe flex basis that I heard over the years in some lessons and tutorials and courses, but they are both kind of not. They are not the one thing that is explaining you how basis works, and that's a little bit the tricky thing. Now, one thing that people often say is you should think about basis as basically the width of your element, and that works fine in that first example when you look at it, because we set our basis to 200 pixels and it kind of grew to those 200 pixels. When we set it to 300 pixels, it's changing to 300 pixels now. So it is kind of the width, except it isn't. Now let's see what happens when we go to the parent element and we change our flex direction, and now we can see it's not the width anymore. Actually, now our 300 pixels are along the vertical axis, and the other thing is just the stretch on the horizontal axis. So now it's not the width at all anymore. So let's just go to the parent element, change this back again, and now we have those 300 pixels. Now, for a starter, it still makes sense to think about the flex basis as a width, just as a width along your main axis. So when you change your main axis to column, then you it's actually your height, but you can think about, in a very crazy term, you can think about it as your width along the main axis, even when it's actually your height. I hope that makes just a little bit of sense.